We're going to start off looking at how the arrow works, and you can see that it appears somewhere in this neighborhood and then it finds its path. So let me do a reset here. So if I click on another, let's click on Chicago. You can see this right in here. I'll click right over here. So let's go to Chicago. You can see that it appears from this spot. It's always in that spot. And so if I click over on Jacksonville over on this spot, you'll see again it's going to fade over here, and then the arrow is going to come over and point. So then from then on out, the arrow stays in place. Oops. And you can click on whatever city you want to go to. We'll go to Houston. And from there we'll go to San Diego. And then we'll go up to San Jose. And so the arrow is just finding its way around, maybe back to Chicago, and it's pointing to that direction. In this spot, there's a center point where the arrow always references from where it's pointing to what. And it's constrained to always turn at 45-degree angles. And that was just a design decision to make the arrow feel like it had a little bit of continuity. And let's take a look at how that's set up. This in here is the center point. So if I move this, let's say a little further up, the arrow is going to point from this perspective always down. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and move it right over here so it's somewhere between San Diego and Phoenix. Now if I run this, it's always going to point to the left if I end up in a California state, and if it's on the other side of Phoenix, it'll be pointing to the right. So here's Phoenix, so the arrow comes, and now here's San Diego, always pointing to the left. And of course it's going to be pointing down because the center point is over here on top of where the arrow is. If I move over to the East Coast, the arrow is still pointing down, but it's pointing this time to the right. And so everything that's east of this line over here will always be to the right. So I can come over here and click on Chicago. That'll have the same orientation. So that's how that works. So if you want to have your arrow point from another direction for whatever reason, you have that option. And the other option you have is to figure out how close the arrow is. So if you click on the arrow artwork, what happens is that everything centers around that white little dot. So I'm going to select my free transform tool, and now I can click on that dot. And if I bring that dot right on top of that point, like that, now the arrow is going to be right on top of the red dot when I run the pointer. So New York goes right inside the dot, Philadelphia inside the dot, and of course Austin inside the dot. So that's where the orientation, the 0 point is right in there, and it's finding that spot. So if you want it to be further, then it's just a matter of moving this little dot here even further out. And now you'll see that it's going to be quite a ways from the dot. In some cases it looks a little awkward because the arrow is actually outside of the state that it's referring to. Like here, it looks like it's trying to point to a place in Nevada. And in New York, it feels like it's pointing the arrow here towards Philadelphia because that's in the line that it falls in. So it's something you have to be careful. In some cases you may want to make the dot a lot bigger, but you'd have to back it off a little bit. That's the way you could do it, to have the dot move from one size circle to another. So let's go see how this works in the code. So in the code, the coordinates of the dot are taken from the target. The target is the text box, and they're also the same coordinates. They're the exact same coordinates as the dot. So they're both, the X and Y position are exactly in the same place. That's why they line up. And down in here is if for whatever reason you don't want to see the arrow in your interface, you could just comment out this event listener here, and a couple of forward slashes in here will stop it from running. So now when I run this and I click on the links, it only links to the target and to the dot animation. And so that's the way that's set up. And if you want to replace the artwork with something else, let me go to where the artwork is for that. In here, we'll go to the artwork of the arrow. And this is the graphic symbol that it's inside arrow art. We'll double click in here and you can replace it with either another arrow or another shape altogether. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another layer, and I'll just freestyle draw another arrow altogether. I'll make this red, and then I'll go ahead and make a red polygon to put it on top of it. So I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and leave the fill to none, and I'll go to my polygon options. So I'll come over here and go to polygon, and over here, whoops, and over here I'm going to make it a three-sided polygon. Just type in the number 3 there. And now I can just click and drag a triangle here, and I'm holding the shift key down so that I can spin it around so that it locks. And that looks interesting enough. And now I'll go ahead and select both of these, and with my alignment options I'll align them up to the center, and then I'll move this so that it runs to this bottom point just right there, so it's just barely tapping. And now the artwork with the arrow, the original arrow, that's this one in here, instead of hiding it, I want to make it into either a guide or a mask, and it can be a mask layer without anything in it, and then that'll also prevent it from being seen. So now if I run the animation, you'll see that I have a different arrow altogether that shows up. Oh, I forgot to turn it on. So let's go back to the code, actions, and I'll turn the arrow back on so it shows up. And now we'll run that. So now I've got this big skinny arrow that comes out of nowhere. You can see it still maintains the drop shadow in relationship to how it works. So you can pretty much draw anything in relationship to how you want to call attention to it. And that's how you can modify the arrow. So your option is to completely turn it off, and like I said before, in the code you can render this useless with 2 forward slashes, and that essentially makes the arrow rotate function unnecessary. And way down here on the bottom we have the arrow rotate function, and that shows up over here and it will stop working. Okay, so let me go back and reset that arrow to the original settings, and I'll go back into my arrow art, and over here I'm going to turn that back into a normal layer, and I'm just going to delete the original, or rather the red arrow that I created. And so I'm right back to where I was. I'll go back to my code now, and we're going to slide down here and look at some of these options. So this is an ease in and ease out effect that's part of a larger library. And this URL here will allow you to access more options and see how they work. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Command C and copy that link, and I'll just do a Command return and run my animation. I'll go ahead and make this full screen, and I'm going to type in the URL that I just worked out in here, and I'll paste it in there, and it gets me to the CreateJS library, where I can look at all these various ease in, ease out options that I can choose from. So let's do a back out, and you can see that it essentially overshoots its target and then it comes back to where it's supposed to be. So this is the time duration of the animation. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on that, and I'm going to do a copy. So back out, and I'm going to go back to my code, and in my code in here I'm going to replace this word over here with back out. And now when I run it, you'll see the arrow appears differently. So let's go to Jackson. Oh, I got to turn it back on, I believe. And turn that back on. Okay, and I'll slide back down over here because I'll make other changes with that. So here you'll see what the difference is. So you see that the arrow animates slightly different. There's always this kind of a little swing that goes beyond the boundary. So I go to Los Angeles, it overshoots it a little bit, and then it comes back to where it's supposed to be. So it's always going to have that effect. So in here, there are different library options that we can try. So, okay, that looks good. Let's try, let's look for something elastic. And you can click on all of these and get a general idea of see what the animation is. So this is a bounce in. This ought to be interesting. So again, I'm going to right click that. I'm going to copy that text, go back to my code here, and I'll double click in here and paste that in place. So bounce in, let's see what that does. And we'll click, we'll go to New York. So it'll bounces out. And so let's go to San Diego, and you'll see it's trying to bounce around. So it's an interesting effect. It looks like it's got the shakes. Not terribly effective for this arrow, but there are other options. Let's see what else we have. I'm going to do a reload here just to clear the screen. And it shows me the default value, which is just a linear animation. All the dots here are spread evenly. That tells you that it's continuously going the same speed. And so let's see what this shine out does. It's a little slight. You can see it's coming in for a soft landing in its speed. Let's try that one. And go to our code, and we'll paste that there. This will be the last example of this. And we'll try that. So you can see it comes in. Let's go to New York. And from New York, we're going to go to Los Angeles. That's a pretty long distance to travel. Or San Diego. And you'll see that it just comes into a slow landing when it arrives. So San Diego. And so it just kind of comes in for a soft landing. That could work too, where it moves enough to get your attention, and then as you get attention to it, it slows down so that you can catch up with the direction of the arrow. So I'm going to do a revert on this. Close this window. Close this window. And I'll go ahead and revert to the original settings. File, revert. And in the next movie, we're going to look at how to set up the text information that links up with the locations that we click on.